Ex-Inmates of Reddit. What was the stupidest thing you've seen a new inmate do on his first day in prison? Story 1. Where I was in prison, they utilized 40mm soft round launchers to respond to group disturbances. Let me tell you, they weren't soft. Kid comes in thinking he's still hardcore from juvenile hall because guards there didn't do anything when people fought. Decided to up and join a gang that he knew nothing about on his first day, thought he was tough, and started to diss the gang they had high tensions with at the time, and started a group disturbance. COs respond, tell him to get down. He refuses and curses at them. Boom! 40mm to his face. Was an accidental shot to the face according to the CO. Face was distorted as hell after. Fractured skull. On his first day. Story 2. There was an old myth that if you challenged the meanest guy in your block to a fight, everyone else would leave you alone. It's true, no one will torment you if you are dead. Kid tried it and got dropped off the 5th tier. First day in general population. Last day in general population. Most guys just want to do their time alone. Most rape and violence in prison is about debt or tax. If you play it straight, 98% of guys will just leave you alone. Fucking someone up on the yard makes your time worse, not better. Loss of privilege, of time in solitary. Most people don't want that. Most of the straight-up psychopaths are in 23-1 lockdown anyway. You get in debt or shoot your mouth off, and you will get settled or taxed. Both are to be avoided. Story 3. This may not have been his first day, but I will never forget this. This while I was in the intake tank, which is the first tank or section you go into after being processed in the county. This young kid comes into the county and keeps complaining that he doesn't get his cannabinol and other marijuana-related prescriptions in jail. He was really arrogant and constantly pissed everyone off. During count 1 day, as we were all in our bunks, he starts complaining again, and then says to the guard, "What if we all riot?" Immediately, like 10 other guys yell very loudly, "We don't know," or agree with him. The guard then says, "What the fuck did you say?" The kid then continues about rioting and that he has rights. Everyone in the tank fucking stays like frozen in their bunk, trying their best to be non-threatening and also show they have no interest in what this moron is saying. So the guard picks him up by his throat and slams him into the wall. After scaring the kid shitless, he explains he has a new charge for inciting a riot. Kid gets hauled off to solitary. Never saw him again, but I heard he spent the rest of his 30 to 60 to 90, whatever amount, days in solitary. Absolutely insane to me that he'd say that in a fucking county jail. Story 4. Went in when I was a young idiot. Our pod was all bunk beds, no cells. Just the room with beds, and a side room with the TV. It was a unit for all the people working the same job. New guy comes in, a little white dude, quiet and kept to himself. Until one night, out of nowhere, he starts sprinting around the room singing at the top of his lungs to the tune of Black Sabbath's Iron Man, but changed the lyrics to, "I am the N-word man, running through the hood from the Ku Klux Klan." Everyone was just kind of frozen for about 15 seconds, seriously confused. Then someone tripped him, and then it was just mayhem until the CO could get enough help to disperse the crowd. I remember being surprised he survived. Everyone in the unit had steel-toe boots for the job we did, holding them and hitting him in with them instead of wearing and kicking. The scene afterwards where all the guys are trying to figure out whose boots are whose and comparing who's had the most blood was freaking surreal. Story 5. I did 14 years in federal prison for wire fraud. I got out last February. I'm 36. Some things I can say are these. While your sexuality may not be an issue outside of prison, inside prison, male inmates who are openly gay are generally disrespected. Gambling and drugs create debts that are at some point unable to be paid and can result in serious issues for yourself. Most prisons operate a social hierarchy based on gang affiliations or hometowns, although there can be large separations based on race. However, rapists and child molesters will basically be free game for anyone who wants to take their shit or torment them. You might have been a badass outside of prison, but generally you can't fight several people at once, which is what would happen if you talk about how much of a badass you are. Keep your shit to yourself and don't talk crazy to people, which is seen as disrespect. Respect/disrespect has a different meaning in prison, and you'll figure it out. Best to just keep to yourself as much as possible unless you want to embrace prison life and become institutionalized. Prison is not a place to make friends. Story 6, I got a bunk restriction while I was in jail on one of my first nights. Twice a day they did roll calls where we all had to sit on our bunk to be quiet, while the officer came bunk to bunk and checked all of our wristbands and made sure we were all who we are. Halfway through, he was doing this. Someone rips the loudest, fattest, longest wet fart I've ever heard in my life. Me, having the mind of a 5-year-old, burst into laughter. I've never heard a fart like this in my life. A few other guys laugh, but even thinking of it now, I giggle about it. Anyways, the officer's like, "All right, settle down." But I can't stop laughing about it. He tells me to calm down. But I tell him through my tears of laughter, I literally cannot help it. I really couldn't. It was the funniest thing that happened the few days I was in there. Anyway, he gets pissed. I try to explain I'm not trying to be rude and disobey him through my laughter, but he isn't having it. Luckily, he just gave me a bunk restriction and didn't punish everyone, but I could see the TV from my bunk, so I just hung out the rest of the night. Story 7. Spent a year in a Bangkok prison. Saw lots of shit go down, but the one story I have that's relevant to your question has to be this English guy that turned up one day. It was actually the first and only other British guy I would encounter while I was there, and the moment he came through the gates, I was called over to try and communicate and translate for him. He was refusing to talk to anyone, basically going on a silent strike, because he thought he wasn't supposed to be there and they were denying his human rights and all that shit. First thing that happens when you enter the prison is that they shave your head. This kid had massive dreadlocks and didn't want anyone touching them, but at this point he had already made his bed, and he was going to have to sleep in it. I went over to him and introduced myself, asked him what his name was, where he was from, etc., but he just stared at me in silence the whole time. One of the guards gave me a photocopy of his passport so I could see his name, age, and where he was from, etc. Against all odds, this kid was actually from my hometown, so my face lit up. Finally, I would have someone to talk to, and I'm sure we could chat shit and bond while we were in there. God, did I need that? But he just refused to engage with anyone, even me, who was trying so hard to get a word out of him. I explained over and over that he'd lost the game. He's in prison now, and there is no way out of it, so just do what the guards say. They're going to shave your head first of all, and there's nothing you can do about it. Because no one had explained to me what exactly was going on. I was just confused why he wasn't talking to me. The more I spoke to him, and the more he refused to talk back, the more pissed off I got. I just couldn't understand why he was being so difficult. And by the end of our encounter, I was fucking shouting at him, telling him to stop being such a little bitch and just accept your fate. I didn't know if he was retarded or genuinely couldn't speak, but it became clear that he was just putting on an act. Eventually, I just told the guards, there is fuck all I can do if he's not willing to speak, so go ahead and do what you've got to do. I said my goodbyes to him and told him he really needs to accept his fate. It will be easier on everyone, and when you're ready to talk, I'll be here. Because let me tell you, that's the best thing you could hope for in a place like this. He ended up being pinned down by the guards and his dreads shaved off while he was screaming and screaming. Of course I felt bad, but come on, time to swallow your pride, mate. He was then admitted to the prison and he came to sit with me. He still refused to speak, so I got a notebook and pen, and we communicated via writing for a few days. The guards didn't know what to do with him, and all the prisoners just thought he was a mental case. I still wasn't sure myself. After a few days of gossip, another prisoner told me that the kid was faking it. When I asked how he knew, he told me that he was arrested at the same police station with him, and the whole time he was in custody, this kid had been screaming bloody murder at the officers, claiming the violation of human rights and all that shit. Then one day when I was having a chat with him by means of writing, he started asking me about the embassy, and I told him about what services they offer and how they can help, etc. Then he wrote down on the paper, "Can I make a phone call through the embassy?" I just looked at him dead on and said, "What good is a phone call if you can't fucking talk?" I couldn't help but chuckle, and he knew the gig was up. At least with me it was. Not long after that, the kid was taken from the prison and carted off to a mental health institution so they could evaluate him. I didn't see him for a few weeks when he suddenly reappeared looking very disheveled and completely traumatized. And wouldn't you know it, he could suddenly speak. He started telling me about the horrors of the mental institution he had just experienced, and my God, it sounded fucking awful. Even worse than the hellhole I was currently in, which is really saying something. We bonded for the month or so, he was there and we exchanged details. I have spoken to him since I've been out, and it turns out we have a fair amount of mutual friends, which is one hell of a coincidence. Anyway, the point of this story is you fucking idiot for simply not cooperating with the guards and the prison rules. It's all well and good, putting up a fight in the courts and with the local police. But once you're past that and you find yourself in prison, just fucking do as you're told. They can make life so much worse for you. Story 8. Long but funny story. I worked for a police department. We arrested a local regular on an outstanding FTA warrant. The guy was always a pain in the ass. The county jail was full, so we were contracted with an adjacent county jail nicknamed the Workhouse. It was old and nasty and had a much tougher urban clientele. It took about 45 minutes to drive there, and on the way, the prisoner was being chatty. He asked me to do him a favor. When we got to the jail, which was, don't put me in with any of those goddamn N-word. We get to the jail and sit the prisoner on the bench. There's a large black woman working the intake desk, and she and I process the paperwork. 15 minutes later, I'm headed out the door when I stop and look at the prisoner on the bench. I turn to the woman and say, "Oh yeah, I forget. He has a request." The prisoner starts violently shaking his head, "No." The woman chuckles and says, "Oh yeah, what's that?" I repeat his request that he doesn't want to be put in with any goddamn N-word. Her eyes get real big and she smiles at me saying, "Yes, sir, I'll take care of that." The prisoner looked like he was going to pass out. She immediately called for 2 guards who came from the back dragging logging chains. These were 2 black guys who looked like they were linebackers in the NFL. I smiled at the prisoner and walked to my cruiser. Story 9. More stupid employee. A good friend, Steve, worked as a locksmith for a medium security prison, a really unpleasant job apparently. He bid on and got the job as groundskeeper. He was the only actual prison employee, and his 4-man staff were trustee prisoners. The job was overseeing grounds using tractors, hand mowers, and lawn equipment. Some minor repairs were allowed, and the shop had tools for repairs. The groundskeeping hut was not on the actual prison grounds, but had its own unmonitored employee driveway and employee entrance. There was a separate locked fenced driveway that went directly into the prison. This was how the prisoners and equipment came and went. The trustees were only searched when they returned to the prison grounds, either on the mowers or when returning to their cells. Otherwise, the groundskeeping hut was not frequently inspected. It was a plum prisoner job. My friend bought an older Harley, which ran but not well. One trustee was a Made motorcycle gang member and my friend, and he bonded over motorcycles. One day, Steve brought his motorcycle to work and showed it to the trustee. The trustee listened to the motor and said the bike needed bearings, which means an overhaul. A $4,000 job. If Steve could bring the crew in an hour or 2 before they were supposed to return to their cells, the trustee felt he could use that extra hour to overhaul the bike in a few weeks. And in the first days, he totally disassembled the Harley's motor. Later that day, while returning to the prison, the trustee got caught smuggling in a small screwdriver, which meant this trustee crew would never return. Steve knew the groundskeeping hut would be inspected the next morning, and he got the motorcycle frame and wheels onto a pickup and took it out the shop. He didn't have time to get the motor parts, which he could claim were leftover lawnmower parts, but he knew that unmistakable motorcycle frame with wheels was his termination. The next day, the inspectors glanced at the parts and made him take all the extra parts to a secure dumpster. He was reprimanded for not inventorying tools daily and having loose mower parts. Harley was toast, but he actually kept his job. Story 10. Never been an inmate, but I did work as a jailer for a short period of time. I was always assigned to the felony pods, so I knew there were a certain number of guys in those pods that really didn't give a fuck. But I didn't dick guys around or be an asshole for no reason, so I was well liked by most of the inmates. One guy came on his first trip to the slammer because he got zanned out and drove into a gas station, then proceeded to snag some cigarettes and other convenience items. I often consider the lifers to be the most laid back, especially the older ones. Don't fuck them, and they won't fuck you, but mess with them, and they mess back hard. So one day I was sitting at one of the tables chatting with a couple of the older long-term residents, and this new guy came in and sat at the table. The old-timers asked the new guy, "So, what you in for? This fucking kid never even looks up and just says murder." I knew what he was in for. He knew what he was in for. And these other 2 well-experienced prison attendees knew damn well he wasn't there for murder. One of them almost snatched him from across the table. I intervened quickly and explained to the kid that this experience could be as shitty as he wanted to make it or as simple. He could lay low and be in and out and back to his regular life, or he could enter this darker world by being a smartass when asked a simple question. I'm sure he was just scared being his first time in and wanted to maybe make a big bad impression, but telling 2 killers that you killed when you barely have hair on your nuts is a very bad first step. If I recall correctly, he stayed in 3 days waiting to bond out, and he didn't leave his cell other than to grab his tray and scarf down his food.